available for future viewing. It will be available for future viewing on the MBA website at mbacares.org/prison-and-jail. mbacares.org/prison and jail. My name is Monica Wedlock Kilpatrick, and I serve as the director of the Disciples Care Exchange and affinity groups for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. This webinar continues a series of webinars and educational trainings offered by the MBA Prison and Jail Ministries Affinity Group. Today's topic is Becoming a Welcoming Church, Safe Sanctuaries and Protocols. In today's world, those convicted of sex offenses are our modern-day lepers. The crimes committed by those labeled sex offenders widely vary. Truth be told, a significant number of those convicted of these crimes are eventually released back into our communities. How does the church welcome and receive these modern-day lepers? How do we create safe sanctuaries and communities that can effectively minister to these children of God? In this webinar, you will learn from a legal expert the conditions and restrictions applicable to those convicted of sex offenses, and from a pastor, how to establish protocols and procedures that make it possible to welcome them into your faith community. At the end of this presentation, there will be time for questions. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to use the live chat feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions or to request technical assistance. If you are participating by phone, you may email your questions or requests to mkilpatrick@mbacares.org. Again, that's mkilpatrick@mbacares.org. After the presentation, we will address as many questions as possible. If your question is not answered here, we will follow up with you via email. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing on our website. To begin, let me introduce our speakers. Mr. Nicholas Haynes is a partner in the Darby and Gazak law firm in Louisville, Kentucky. A graduate of the University of Dayton Law School, Nick served as a public defender in Eastern Kentucky, and it was there that he worked with individuals accused of sex offenses. He has presented on this topic before the Kentucky Bar Association at its annual continuing education program. Nick is married and has 2 children. He and his family are members of the Christ Methodist Church in Louisville. And Reverend Dean Bucalis, ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, is the founding pastor of New Life in Christ Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, a congregation he began inside a women's reentry facility in Louisville, Kentucky. He is currently the executive director of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, MB3, an ecumenical reentry program that trains small faith-based groups to work with ex-offenders upon their release from prison. MB3 is also an MBA Incubate and Disciples Care Exchange partner. Dean is a trained volunteer facilitator for the Juvenile Justice Pilot Program in Jefferson County, Kentucky, sponsored by Restorative Justice Louisville. And he currently serves as the mission specialist for MBA's Prison and Jail Ministries Affinity Group. At this time, I will turn the conversation over to Nick and Dean. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. We're glad to be able to bring this webinar to you all. It's really the third in a series of webinars that we have offered with respect to becoming a welcoming congregation, and other topics that we've covered are welcoming people who have returned from places of incarceration. We've done a webinar talking about how we welcome people who have co-occurring conditions and might have mental illness issues along with addiction issues. Today we're going to be talking about what we do as a congregation to establish safe sanctuaries to welcome folks who've been convicted of sex offenses. It's a topic we don't talk about very much in our congregations, and a lot of that is because there are so many myths and misconceptions about this particular topic. And as we add on a layer of fear and alienation, our congregations have often become places where those who've been convicted of these offenses do not feel particularly welcome. But what we realize is that these folks, most of them who've been convicted of these offenses, will be returning to our communities. They've served their sentences. They're often under community supervision, and frequently they're looking for a church home. What we have to do initially is begin to dispel some of the stereotypes that we've attached to these particular individuals who, along with everyone else, are children of God. Uh, but these stereotypes arise from so many, many different areas, aspects, from the media, from conversations, from misinformation, and from miseducation. So we're going to try to bust a couple of those myths this afternoon. Then Nick's going to talk a little bit about what exactly are people who are convicted of sex offenses. What are their convictions really about? What are some of the conditions that are attached to that? What are some of the treatment programs that are provided to these folks? And then I'm going to speak to what we can do in our congregations to not only become a more welcoming place, but a place that's equipped to be safe for everyone involved. So, Nick, let's start with some myth busting. Why don't you take the first one? This one I think is something that we are frequently convinced that a lot of these sexual assaults, particularly the ones that the media lifts up, are events that occur by people who we don't know, people who are strangers.
Sure. Again, thank you for having me, Dean, and everyone involved. So the first one, that most sexual offenders are, or sexual offenses are committed by strangers. Kind of what the picture, I think what a lot of us may have in our mind is the from the previous slide, the creepy guy who's sitting on the park bench in the trench coat, and it is the watching the little children. And while yes, that may happen, the overwhelming majority of sexual offenders are actually people that are known to the victim. And it is very likely and very often someone who is in the home themselves or has a very close connection to the victim. So while I don't kind of bust that myth to go in the opposite direction, that we should be scared of everyone, the idea of what we see on TV is not usually what happens in real life. Dean?
The second myth that we want to address is that the majority of sex offenders are caught, convicted, and imprisoned. We want to believe that because it makes us feel safe, but the reality is that the majority of people who are involved in these offenses are often not caught, convicted, or sent to prison. One of the reasons is because a lot of these crimes are not reported. Many of them are crimes that involve family members. A lot of these crimes involve people who are victims that don't really want to report that, either because they're embarrassed or they don't want to have the publicity attached to them, or they don't want to go through this particular process. This is certainly the case with people who have been victims of rape or other violent sex offenses. While we think that most of the folks that commit these crimes are incarcerated, the reality is that many folks who have committed these offenses are still on the street, and they're still in our communities. Many of whom are attracted to places where they may have opportunities to commit or recommit other types of offenses. So it makes us realize that we have to be very vigilant with respect to, particularly in churches, to set up some protocols, some understanding that many of the people who are involved in these types of offenses are really not, they're not folks who have been incarcerated at all. And so when we think about this particular myth, we need to remember that a lot of these offenses are occurring between people that know each other, people who are in intimate relationships. Some of the crimes are convicted by people who are involved with statutory rape, which is when someone is over the age of 18 and they engage in sexual conduct with somebody under the age of 18 or younger. And so we just need to begin understanding that that not everybody that we're concerned about is actually behind bars. Nick, let's look at the next one.
So the idea that most sex offenders reoffend. In actuality, sex offenders, in looking at their sexual offense, actually reoffend at a much lower rate than other offenders. And what I mean by that is if you have a felon who has been convicted of a non-sexual crime, let's say burglary, and their likelihood of reoffending to commit another felony crime of frankly any type of felony, take that number compared to sexual offenders and their likelihood to reoffend in a sexual nature. The idea that a sex offender reoffends with another sex crime is actually much lower. It happens at a much lower rate than the person who commits a burglary who may be convicted of a burglary or another non-sexual felony again. Again, you really start to get into the weeds on some of these data, because certainly not all sexual offenses are the same. Different sex offenses have different recidivism rates. Again, the rate at which someone commits another crime, just like a non-violent felony, have different rates of recidivism. However, taken as a whole, sex offenders are less likely to recommit or commit again a sex offense versus other felons. Dean?
Another myth that is frequently repeated is that the sexual offense rates are higher than ever and continuing to climb. And we hear this mostly from the media. The media tends to exaggerate a lot of criminal offenses. I think sometimes when I turn on the television at night for the nightly news, I think we're under siege, because all I hear about are crimes being committed. But the reality is that it's a lot of hyperbole, and particularly with respect to sex offenses. And then when we begin to putting statistics to that and doing some research, we realize that over the years, the number of sexual assaults that have been reported are decreasing in number. And some of that is because people have a higher understanding, people are more vigilant, people are more attentive, and there's a greater support system in the criminal justice system for victims, so that people have a tendency to report more crimes. But the reality is that many of the crimes are being reduced. Some of that is because folks have been incarcerated and are going through treatment programs. But as Nick mentioned, many people who have committed sexual related crimes, the recidivism rate is much lower. So it's not as if things are getting worse. In fact, statistics will show us in regard to this particular area that the number of these types of crimes is actually going down in number. Nick?
Sure. All sex offenders are male. Now, this is a myth as to the word all. There are a number of women who do commit sex crimes. However, this is not to say that a majority of offenders aren't male. They are. And this is one thing that, yes, you will have to deal with both male and female offenders potentially coming to your congregation. The vast majority are male. However, again, when you break it down in different crimes against different victim types, a sizable amount on the range of about 20% of sex-related crimes against children are perpetrated by females. So we shouldn't look at it as a one size fits all. We can't look at it as I know what a sex offender looks like because often we don't, and we run the risk of both misjudging someone and not realizing potentially the seriousness or any other number of factors about someone who's been convicted of a sex crime. There's a lot of pitfalls in pigeonholing one type of offender all the time.
The last one that we want to address, and there are many more out there, but we thought these were the ones that seem to be perpetrated in our conversations the most. This one is that children who are sexually assaulted will sexually assault others when they grow up, and I actually have been a victim of believing this particular myth that those folks who tend to be caught and convicted of sex offenses have been sexually abused as children, and that they are repeating that behavior. But the reality is, once again, statistically, that that's just simply not true. That most sex offenders have not been sexually assaulted as children, and in fact, there's not a higher rate of that among people who are convicted of sex offenses. It's just something that, once again, we think should be the case, I guess, but it in reality it's not the case, and so we need to begin to demythologize some of these things because they tend to demonize people and they tend to result in our alienating people. What we're going to talk a little bit about now, and Nick is going to lead us through this, is what actually constitutes a sex offense, and then what are some of the ramifications of that?
Sure. So, sorry, that was my fault. So, a sex offender. A sex offender, very simply put, is someone who has been convicted of a sex offense. Convicted means either they pled guilty, so they avoided or decided not to go through with a trial, or they have been convicted by a judge or a jury and have been sentenced to something related to a sex offense. Examples of sex offenses really kind of run the gamut. But of course, what the very serious ones that may come to our mind first and foremost, things as rape and incest, are certainly sex offenses. But there are another category of offenses that, when looked at an allegation factually, actually have nothing to do or did not involve any sexual contact, such as kidnapping or assault or murder. I mean, of course, all of those very serious crimes. By no means am I trying to downplay any of those. However, they still can in some states, Kentucky being one of those states where I am, they can trigger one being labeled a sex offender. If it is kidnapping of a minor, if it is assault of a minor. So you can't also say, well, I know the type of crime that person committed, or at least I think I did. You really need to find out in fairly good detail about what that actually involved. And any of those offenses can potentially get labeled one a sex offender. And there's also a third group of offenses that occur after one has been convicted. And we'll go through this process. I'm getting the cart in front of the horse a little bit, but on the idea that you have been convicted or pled guilty of a sex offense, you have served jail time, you have been released, and are now under a certain set of restrictions on probation or parole, and one's then failure to abide by all of those rules after he or she is released can be a new sex offense in and of itself. Again, unrelated to any sexual contact, but a failure to follow the rules that we're going to talk about here in a little bit can also be labeled a separate and another sex offense, which, if nothing else, may raise the amount of time one has to register as a sex offender, again, which we'll get to in a moment. So what are the punishments and treatments? I talked about it very briefly. First and foremost is jail time. Most sex offenders do serve prison time, usually in the order of years. And during that prison time, that the treatment or the counseling that he or she may receive varies widely across the country. Some states do require mandatory counseling. Some states, like in Kentucky, have moved away from a mandatory counseling requirement and go to one that is highly, I guess it's more of a carrot, I'll say, in that if you do go through counseling in prison, you potentially get time off of your sentence, kind of quote unquote good time, the time that is taken off for other people who go back to school or don't have any other violent acts or don't get into trouble or anything like that. Counseling is one of those things. And part of the hairiness, part of the issue that comes up with counseling is certainly counseling is good. And if you have actually committed a crime, it is a good thing. I will say, as a defense attorney, part of the issue there is that you have offenders who have been convicted who, to get into counseling in Kentucky, have to admit that they've done something wrong. Now, certainly if you are a person who has committed a crime and you are looking to go through rehabilitation yourself and move on, admitting that you committed an act is not a problem. And actually, a majority of people do fall into that category after they are sentenced and put in jail. However, if you are such a person who you may meet if your congregation is going into prisons or doing some kind of prison ministry, you may find someone who says, I have both been convicted of a sex offense, however, I'm not going through counseling, again, here in Kentucky, because admitting that you committed a crime obviously potentially runs afoul of your right to appeal. So there are a number of, or at least a few conflicting things to think about when you are speaking to someone who has been convicted of a sex crime. But certainly a majority of them either are court ordered to go through counseling or seek it out themselves. Now we're going to jump to after one has been released from prison. So whatever that experience was that he or she had, however long that was, and whatever amount of counseling he or she had, more often than not, those people are released. And now in, I believe, all 50 states, there is a requirement that most sex offenders register. And a registrant is someone who has committed a sex offense, who has to put their information out publicly about where they live, and it will be published where they live, what type of offense they committed, and how long they have to register for. Now, this is going to vary across the country. I put up a map to show the different amounts of time people have to register for. There are a unfortunately growing number of states that, regardless of the offense that you committed, whether it is, and I don't mean to trivialize or minimize any sexual offense, but if one accepts that there is a continuum of sexual related crimes, one side potentially being public indecency, that for whatever reason there was a person who exposed themselves out in public. to a very severe crime of rape. Uh, there are different registration periods for different offenses, but the trend is to keep raising that minimum level. Here, for example, in Kentucky, there used to be offenses that you did not have to register for, and then it became, I believe it was 5 to 10 years, and now the minimum in Kentucky is 20 years, regardless of the sexual offense. But if you do plead guilty or are convicted of any sexual offense, the minimum in Kentucky is 20 years, and you will see the minimum in other states is lifetime. Uh, Certainly, I'm not here to argue the merits of crime and punishment, but if you do accept that the American justice system is based on both a principle of punishment, but also I have paid my dues. I have spent my time in jail and done what I was supposed to do, and now I'm looking to be rehabilitated. The idea that some people have to register for the rest of their lives somewhat goes against that idea, because you will always have that scarlet letter on, so to speak. Registrants who are coming back into the community face a whole host of complicating issues. Um, First and foremost is the negative feelings that most citizens have, uh, and maybe rightfully so. I mean, certainly these are crimes that can be very heinous in nature, or not always, but can be very heinous in nature. And there is that idea that all sex offenders, going back to that myth part, that all sex offenders is the man kind of lurking in a dark alleyway. So the idea that I'm coming back to society, I have spent time in prison, and now I'm looking for a job can be very confounding to most offenders, and they have to deal with that public backlash, if not outright hostile acts against them. And there are restrictions about where they can live, and it is very difficult for many to find a job. In addition to difficulty finding a job, many offenders and many registrants have residency restrictions. And this goes in large part kind of hand in hand with the idea of having to register for a period of time, because it's not only the registering, I have to tell everybody who I am and what I did, but I have additional restrictions that even though I may have served a number of years in prison, I still have, I am now prohibited from living certain places. As the example I put on, most states restrict an offender from living 1,000 to 2,000 feet from places where children gather. And in some states, there are limits as close as 500 feet. Here in Kentucky, it is 1,000 feet. And where children gather is also a pretty nebulous term. It is anything from schools to daycares to parks to playgrounds. Some states see that category as a public bus stop. Now, I'm not talking about a child's bus stop, but a public bus stop that adults may use. They may say, well, that is a place where children can gather, which, again, not here to argue against it, but I will simply remind you that if you believe, or if you disbelieve the myth that the average sex offender is the creepy guy with the trench coat lurking to get children he doesn't know, then one might question what benefit, even to someone of the most strident crime and punishment believer, what benefit does a residency restriction have to society if the majority of the problem is people within a household who know the victim very intimately, who very well may be having contact with someone who might otherwise fall into this category of places I can't live around, but can still live with. These are all questions that are continued to be debated. But I think hopefully you'll remember and think about the next time that you have to deal with someone in this population. Uh, and I'll just say one last note on a registrant's living restrictions. Here in Kentucky, at least, uh, even a person who gets out and is lucky enough to find a place to live that is outside of the 1,000 feet restriction, that can all change for him or her overnight, because Kentucky, and I think many states are very similar, have placed an ongoing duty on the registrant, him or herself, to know what both is around him and what comes in around him or her. For example, if I find a home that is 1,000 feet, more than 1,000 feet away from all of these places, and someone decides to open up a daycare in my neighborhood, the onus is on me as the registrant to to change that. And what that really means is now I have to move. And of course, the Constitution and property rights still apply to all of us, and certainly those who it applies to people who are released from prison, arguably until they run into something like this, and the state can come in and go, no, you can no longer live there. So it can be a very tumultuous time of coming back to society and finding a job and reacclimating him or herself. But then there are all these not only kind of landmines, but also bullets whizzing by too. That it is a fluid situation potentially for people, and it's understandable. I think that it's difficult to adapt back. I talked a little bit about this before, but some states also have restrictions on not only where you can live, but actually the movement of an offender. That a small minority of states do prohibit them being around or even walking through these areas. So if one is lucky enough to find a job, he or she still may have an issue in having to take a circuitous route to that job, a longer route to that job, one more complicating factor in becoming successful and a productive member of society after one's release. And add all of that onto the research that shows there is no tangible benefit to enforcing a residency restriction. Certainly, we can say it makes us feel good that these people did bad things, and they're punished when they went to jail, they're punished when they get out of jail, and there's a certain catharsis that society takes from that. But if you are a crime and punishment person, but also a person who wants to think, hopefully, these people will not commit another crime again, and it's maybe a bit of a false sense of security, the idea that residency restrictions are keeping us safe. For all of those things that I've just talked about, residency restrictions don't have the effect of we're going to keep bad people away from a potential victim population. The statistics aren't there that it has that benefit. And to the contrary, research has found that banishing offenders out past city borders and things like that. I mean, certainly that would happen if a person in a metropolitan area was returning to that metropolitan area after a prison sentence. There's no way here in Louisville that someone could be within most places, live in most of metropolitan Louisville, because schools and daycares and things like that are so prevalent. One has to move out to the country to get away from all of that. And if you are then banishing this population outside of cities, out past where many of their support structures may be, and if you believe the idea that most offenders prey on people that they know, well, now potentially they are banished from society just around people that is a that could be possibly a victim population. Uh, Away from a job, bored, and I don't think you don't have to connect many dots and to think what may happen because we didn't want these people around. So the importance of a church or a faith community to accept these people in and help them get acclimated not only benefits them, I think it benefits all of us as well, the non-offender population. Because without stable employment, offenders are at a higher risk of reoffending. I mean, when we talked earlier about just bare percentages of how many people do offend, when you start to break down those numbers, people who don't have jobs, who don't have a good support structure, who have a difficulty finding places to live, that is the subset of the group that does reoffend at a higher rate. And finding suitable employment, finding those support structures are absolutely key to success after you are let out of prison. And it does take some time. I mean, it takes changing of attitudes, not only for you to help out these people, but a changing of attitudes that you may have to be a catalyst of to get an employer or someone else to help out these people, because it really does take a village. Instability here is, at least in my opinion, is the number one um, antagonist against successful offender released. It is something that constantly eats away at sex offenders. Frankly, instability is something that constantly batters all of us. I mean, we all like a stable environment. And sex offenders who don't have that, it makes them more likely to reoffend, it makes them unsuccessful, and it just destabilizes a whole population of people who we all have a common interest in um, rehabilitating and getting them back on the right track. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dean.
Thank you, Nick. You set the context for us, and that was very helpful. Because what we've heard from you is how difficult it is, not only for anyone who is returning from places of incarceration, but particularly for people who've been convicted of sex offenses, to make a successful, healthy, positive reentry back into our communities. And when people don't do that, the probability of them reoffending, as you mentioned, increases, and we're less safe. So the antidote to that is how then do we create a circumstance and situation where people can be successful? And our contention has always been that if it's not the church, then where would that be? Uh, and so the question for us is, what would Jesus do? And at the very beginning of our webinar, Monica mentioned that sex offenders really are much like our modern day lepers. Um, they were folks who were ostracized in Jesus' time. They were alienated. Um, they were singled out. They were forced to wear particular types of clothing and cover their mouth. And when people came by them, they had to let people know by screaming out that they were unclean. And they were outside the camp. They were people who were kept on the margins, and Jesus understood that. And so when we see the stories in Scripture of Jesus and his encounters with those who had leprosy, and that was once again, much like sex offenses, leprosy had a wide range of diseases that were under that. But what Jesus did was he encountered that person in a loving, kind, compassionate way. The stories of Jesus encountering the man with leprosy that's found in 3 of our gospels uh, is a very tender story. he met with that person who came to him. He asked him what he wanted, and then Jesus healed him. And when he healed him, he was moved with the sense of pity and compassion in such a way that he felt the need to make this person whole. And really, our criminal justice system is designed to do just that. People have committed their crimes, they have served their sentences, and now we hope that they become healthy, productive citizens. And yet we set so many obstacles and barriers for them that it's very difficult for anyone in those circumstances to come to a place where they can become whole. Uh, and what I so appreciate about the ministry of Jesus is that he not only heals this person and touches him in a very intimate and moving way, but he sends him back into the community. He sends him back so that he can then become integrated back into the place where he had been formerly abandoned. And that is the model that Jesus has left us with as the church. So how do we do that? How do we um, how do we affect that type of circumstance in our churches, knowing that the people who are coming back have struggles and obstacles, and in some ways are at risk themselves, but we also want to make sure that our own congregations and communities are safe for them. So we know from people who have had experiences with this that this is very possible, and it's a very, very powerful ministry. Uh, I want to have us listen to Reverend Brian Gerard from First Christian Church in Louisville to share his experiences in this particular area. Apparently, we're having some difficulty with the sound. What we will encourage you to do is uh, go online after this presentation. Hopefully, when we post this webinar on the NBA website, you'll be able to to hear Brian's message, because it's a really very helpful one, uh, as he and his congregation dealt with somebody in his congregation who had been convicted of a sex offense, and how they approached that in a very positive, reconciling way, and in a very uh, spiritually mature way, where they were understanding of the circumstances. They were forgiving, and yet they also were vigilant, and created some boundaries and restrictions for that individual who had been a member of their congregation. What it brings us to is an understanding that um, while we are concerned about those who are coming back from places of incarceration who we know have been convicted of sex offenses, the reality is that in every one of our congregations, there are people who have been involved in some type of sex offense, as we mentioned earlier, many of which have gone unreported. And the other reality is that those who are sexual predators, those people that we think of who are predators, are often drawn to our faith communities because we are so welcoming. And so the issue for us is, as we open our arms and welcome people, how do we do that in a way that allows us to be careful and safe and create the boundaries that we want to create so that our families are safe, our members are safe, but also there is a safety factor for those folks who are coming back to our communities. So what I want to recommend is that we look at some of the ways in which we can set up some protocols in our congregations so that we can be vigilant. And the United Methodist Church has been on the forefront of providing us with information and materials with respect to this particular area. And I want us to be aware of some of those resources. But some of the things I want to mention that we can do in our congregations that are very, very effective have to do with setting up our own systems so that we can work with people who are known sex offenders, but we also can develop what we would hopefully consider to be a safe sanctuary. The first thing we need to do is begin educating our congregation. So I would recommend that this webinar and some of the information that Nick shared earlier be something that could begin that conversation so that people realize what we're dealing with when it comes to these particular issues. Because when people mention that, oh, there's a sex offender in our congregation, unless there's some groundwork that's laid, unless we have some way in which we can begin a conversation that's positive and proactive, all sorts of havoc can break out in an uneducated and misinformed congregation. So educating the congregation about the need for a safe sanctuary policy. These are policies that are really designed to be preventive. These are policies that are put into place so that when issues arise, there are rules, regulations, policies that the congregation can look to and deal with that, as opposed to just reacting when these things may arise. To communicate with families and parents of those children in the congregation about the importance of having a policy like this. Now, some may say, oh, we're a small church. We don't have a policy like this. We don't need a policy like this. If you go online and some of the resources that we have put at the end of this webinar, you'll see that the United Methodist Church has policies for small, medium, large churches. Tailor your policy to the needs of your congregation and what you can do effectively. Don't set up the bar too high where you can't meet the policies that you have put into place, but put into place those things that are realistic for your congregation. So once you adopt the policy, then Nick will tell you as an attorney that it's important for you to follow the policy. Ignorance is no longer a defense with respect to this. That we didn't know, we didn't have a policy. There's too much information out there for any congregation to say, well, we just didn't know, and it becomes a stewardship issue. To be realistic, that we become stewards of our resources, and if we place our churches in a circumstance of liability, then we jeopardize the resources of our congregations. When somebody comes into your congregation that you either suspect or know is a sex offender, what I always recommend is that the pastor sit down and meet with that person, to talk with them, to get to know them, to find out what their background is, to find out what restrictions and conditions there may be on their release, to get permission perhaps to talk with their probation or parole officer to see if they're in a treatment program. The more information that you have, the more information you can share with their permission, the better for the congregation. And sharing that with elders or with the church board so that people know that not only are policies in place, but we're aware of this circumstance and we're taking effective steps to monitor that particular circumstance. And then one of the things that we've done, because we have worked with a number of sex offenders who have been convicted and are returning to our communities, we actually train small mentoring groups that can work with people who have come back from places of incarceration, so that they have a safe place in that congregation, and the congregation knows that there are people that they trust, that they know in the congregation, who are working with this particular person, and trying to make sure that things are done well and things remain safe, and that there are protocols that are in place and that they're being followed. We have some resources at the end of this webinar. As I mentioned, there are a couple of very good books that are worthy of study that are listed back in the back of the webinar, as well as some links to resources where you can see and look at particular protocols that churches have implemented. There's a lot of information in this area. If your church has an insurance company that you work with, I would recommend talking with those folks to make sure that you have a policy that complies with that insurance company's protections. If you have an attorney in your congregation, that's always somebody that's good to connect with to make sure that what you're doing is effective, because some reporting requirements you have to be careful about. And what we do know is that when there are any circumstances involving children, that those things need to be reported. So you need to find out what the church requirements are. The more information, the more education, the more out in the open, the more dialogue, the more conversation, the better, as you move the congregation to a place where they can become welcoming and feel safe and feel equipped to welcome anyone of God's children into the congregation, so that they can become the people that God created them to be. Monica, I'm going to go back to you and open it up for any questions that people might have.
Great, thank you. Thank you to both you and Nick. Some really important information there. And so a lot of things to think about as we work to create communities and churches that are welcoming to all. There are a few questions that I'd like to pose to you all and have you answer those as you see fit. And so the first is, what do you do when you have members in your congregation who have been victims of a sexually related offense, who express concern and fear about the possibility of someone who's been convicted of a sex offense coming to the congregation?
I'll take that one initially, Nick, and you might have something to add. But what we've discovered is that we have to be very sensitive to people who have been victims of these types of crimes, whether they've been reported crimes or sometimes unreported crimes where people have been the victims of sex offenses, because there's a great deal of fear that can arise, a sense of being re-victimized, and we need to make sure that those folks who are members of our congregation who may have concerns feel safe themselves. And there may be circumstances, and we've dealt with this in some of our situations in churches, where there are a number of folks who are so uncomfortable with the knowledge that somebody who's been convicted of a sex offense is returning to the congregation or coming to that congregation, that we recommend that they go to a congregation where that may not be so much of an issue. We need to have open conversations about that. But as Nick mentioned earlier on, the fact that somebody has been convicted of a sex offense may or may not have anything to do with your own personal circumstance, because it's such a wide range of offenses that comes under that umbrella.
And I think again, it is worth mentioning, and certainly this may not win the day or win the argument with everyone who has a concern, but you are hopefully and potentially, bringing these people into a community. Yes, and they may have to be in close physical proximity to a prior victim, um, but the hope is that you are creating a support structure that you and your fellow congregants are preventing that person from reoffending, or at least creating a support structure to make that less likely. Some people, of course, are always going to say, well, that's great, but I don't want that around me. But I think that it is a selling point, if I may use that term, the idea that we are preventing a further problem by enveloping them into our faith community.
Great. I have another question for you all. Can you go over a process when there are allegations of sexual contact by church volunteers or allegations of sexual contact of minors by family or friends outside of the church?
And I think, of course, this sets up a situation where, or maybe does not discuss what structures that the church had in place beforehand. But I think this does speak to the important need for a safe sanctuaries policy to be in place. So if heaven forbid this does happen, you aren't scrambling. I mean, you, for better or for worse, you will know and have a policy in place. This is what you do. Really, first and foremost, though, what you do is you want to contact the authorities. You do not want to handle this in-house. Um, Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go behind someone's back or anything like that. But if there is a serious allegation, you don't want to be the one, from a liability standpoint, doing the investigation. You need to turn that over. Um, After that, you need to, of course, be involved in any investigation and be willing to um, put people out there who can be interviewed and whatnot. But from a liability standpoint, it is the best that you aren't doing that investigation yourself, because of course the allegation that could come after that is that you tried to cover up something. And even if there is no there wasn't any actual malice or any actual trying to cover up something, it is often an allegation that gets levied when you are the only ones who have this knowledge for a certain period of time. So the quicker that you can expose it to sunlight, and not wash your hands of it, but get authorities involved, the better.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. Our next question is, what is the best way to find out if someone has been convicted of a sex offense, and what restrictions may apply to them?
Most states, and I can't think, I think there is actually a clearinghouse website for all of the states, but each state should have its own website. Um, and so if a person is coming who, obviously you have some inclination that he or she is an ex-felon, I would presume that that's kind of what is bringing about this want for us to find out more information. But you should be able to go on and find out, by putting in a name, that he or she, what crime he or she has committed, how long he or she has to register for. Different states are going to have different formats of their website. Different states are going to have a little more or a little less information available. But almost all, I would almost dare say all states will have some kind of clearinghouse website for that kind of information.
One of the things that I recommend is just sitting down and meeting with the person and talking with them and asking them about the circumstances that you may be concerned about. Most people who who have been convicted of these offenses know that their name is out there. They know that people are going to find out about them. I think most that I've met with would rather just meet it head on and begin talking about it without trying to conceal that. And so I think having those conversations, particularly with the pastor, is one of the best ways of addressing that. And then, as I mentioned before, trying to get information with the individual's permission from the parole officer to find out exactly what the conditions of that person's release are, and that and the conditions of supervision, so that mistakes aren't made, and the church isn't inviting somebody into a situation where they really shouldn't be present, and that can occur with children in the church, for example, or if the church has a daycare center. So you want to be protective of not only the congregation but also of the individual.
Excellent. This next question may be for many folks, as we imagine that a lot of churches have safe sanctuary policies, but many do not. So how and when do you start a conversation about implementing a safe sanctuary policy in your congregation?
Well, I think that if you don't have a policy, as soon as this webinar is over, then you should contact somebody in your congregation and begin that process, because it's better to do it proactively than to do it reactively. It's better to have any lawyer will tell you that. I think Nick will concur that lawyers would much rather see things proactively put in place that will prevent problems as opposed to deal with problems after they occur. It's just so much easier to deal with that. And with this type of webinar, the conversation can begin as to why this is necessary, why this is important. People will say, and I've had this experience with congregations that I've served, oh, she's been our child care worker for 30 years. We don't have any problems, or we don't have any worries about her behavior. And what my response is, it's not so much that we're worried about her behavior, but all it takes is an allegation against her by somebody by one of the children who may have said something to their parents that gets misconstrued or misinterpreted. That individual, the church school teacher, may be responsible and potentially liable for something like that. And then again, the church. So when we talk about putting these policies together, they're really to protect the people who work in churches. That's why we recommend doing background checks. That's why we recommend doing interviews. That's why we recommend having people who are members of the congregation for a certain period of time before they're even considered to be working with youth or children. But the earlier you get something like that in place and have the church buy into it and understand the need for it, I can guarantee you that the level of anxiety in the life of that congregation will dramatically reduce.
And having a policy in place does go far in preventing a finding of liability later. Now, it may not prevent an act, but part of the civil liability on churches is what, as we've been talking about, what policies and procedures did you have in place? That is, if not the only question, the big question that is asked. It's not you are the church are civilly liable because this happened, but you, the church, are potentially liable because you didn't take the necessary steps. So it is not a panacea. I mean, or it's not a pill to prevent this from happening at all. But it is a list and a documented procedure to say, no, look, we took all reasonable steps, because that's what's the church is being judged against. If the unspeakable happens, did you take reasonable procedures? Not did you do everything and lock up everybody and make sure that nobody could ever have any bad interaction, but the reasonable procedures are what you were going to be judged against. And this is a very good step in saying, yes, we did. Here's what we implemented all of these policies.
One other aspect of that, Monica, that I think is important, because what arises is people that they don't want people to think, well, there's a problem in their church, that's why they have this policy. Uh, the opposite is actually the effect. So pastors that I know and work with who have instituted policies, one of the things that they do when a young family with children come into that church, they hand them a pamphlet that lists the policy. And what that does for that congregation, as well as that family, is put everybody at ease. Young families want to know that there are protections in place and that a congregation is aware of this because they want their children to be safe in the hands of the people with whom they are left. So it's really in many ways in this environment and in our culture, it is a way of a church becoming more welcoming and inviting to families and their children because that's what people are looking for. I know that when my grandchildren are dropped off at church, I want them to be dropped off at a church that has a policy that's going to assure their protection uh, and be vigilant about that. And I think virtually everybody feels the same way.
Thank you. I think we have time just for one more question from our audience, and then we'll need to wrap up. That question is, what can we do as a church to help with changing or encouraging new laws, policies, treatment programs, etc., in order to better serve offenders beyond the reach of the local church? So an advocacy question.
I think that first starts with changing people's perception. I mean, that's the first step. Is having open discussions about not only how do we deal with an offender in our congregation, but frankly, even if we have these policies in place and hopefully we will never have to implement any of the protections and we never have to deal with these people. There is a real benefit to changing that mindset, educating people so people from your congregation can go out and talk knowledgeably to other people unrelated to your faith community about these realities. And certainly beyond that, I would encourage you to contact um, public defenders offices in your state. At least I know here in Kentucky, they are a real catalyst for changes in these laws. That's not going to be the case everywhere, but surely there will be groups in your state who already are taking up the mantle to different levels of efficacy to change these laws and both implement victims' rights and protections, but also offender policies and ways to uh, help them become acclimated back to society. Uh, and beyond that, if you can't find any of those, I encourage you to pick up your phone and call your state or national congressman or woman and see what type of resources or what areas that they might be able to point you in.
One of the things that I think everybody can do, as Nick mentioned, is educate ourselves about this particular issue. And once we're educated, then we can then move to the next step. But as Nick pointed out earlier in the webinar, a lot of the restrictions that we've placed upon people who've been convicted of sex offenses, as well as other people who've been convicted of felonies, don't really have the outcomes that those particular laws we think were designed to promote. And so by dismantling some of those things, by some of the mythology that's attached to it, we can hopefully begin to put together a legal structure that is much more oriented toward rehabilitation and oriented toward healing and moving people towards places of wholeness and success and productivity. Because some of the laws that we have in place now were really implemented out of ignorance and fear. And what we need to do is tailor them so that they can be effective in doing what we hope that they are designed to do.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great way to end our webinar today, as we invite you to consider the many ways that your congregation might get involved or further your ministries in becoming welcoming congregations. We want to thank you for your time and apologize for any technical difficulties you may have experienced. The video of Brian Gerard, our PowerPoint from today's webinar, and the recording of the entire presentation will be available on the MBA website soon for your convenience, and we invite you to share these resources with others. A special thank you to Dean Bucalis and Nicholas Haynes for today's outstanding presentation. We really appreciate your time in preparing and sharing this important information with us. To get connected to the MBA Prison and Jail Ministries Affinity Group, please email us at prisonministries@mbacares.org or visit the website at www.mbacares.org/prison-and-jail. For questions for Nick, he's graciously given his phone number for you to ask any additional questions, and that number is 502-412-5020. Again, that's 502-412-5020. This ends our 2016 webinar series. We invite you to go back to our resource page and check out all of the webinars from this past year that we've been able to share with you. Please also visit our website in the coming months for information on webinar topics for 2017 around prison and jail related issues. Remember to like us on MBA, like MBA on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter, as well as visit our webpage for more information related to Disciples Health and Social Service Ministries. And look out for more information on all of our upcoming events. We thank you and hope that you have a great afternoon.